Welcome to Psychedelics, Past, Present, Future, a lecture series co-organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice at the University of Winnipeg and the Technoscience and Regulation Research Unit at Dalhousie University. We're featuring speakers researching psychedelics, drugs, and consciousness-altering practices. Psychedelics and plant medicines have many justice implications, but touch on philosophy and history, chemistry and ecology, indigenous knowledge and relations too. I acknowledge we are situated on ancestral indigenous lands on Treaty 1 territory. I acknowledge this territory is also the heartland of the Métis people. As a settler, I acknowledge that Winnipeg's water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Thanks to the University of Winnipeg event team and the media team for working on this. Here's the format. Our speaker will have the floor. The co-host and myself will ask a few questions, and we'll open up the questions to the audience as well. If you're in the audience and you have questions, please pop them into the Q&A tab. Now, let me introduce two very important people. First, our co-host, Dr. Agnieszka Dahl, is a postdoctoral fellow at the Faculties of Law and Medicine, Dalhousie University, and a member of the Health Law Institute and Technoscience and Regulation Research Unit at Dal. Agnieszka works at the intersections of law, medicine, and society, and her current ethnographic project examines the regulation of psychedelics in Canada. And today's speaker, Dr. Catherine Hendy, is a medical anthropologist and science studies scholar who uses ethnographic methods to investigate how biomedical knowledge produced in clinics, laboratories, and trials is taken up by different groups of actors. Dr. Hendy has a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in sociocultural anthropology. Her doctoral research ethnographically followed the development of the drug Mdma, better known as the recreational drug ecstasy, as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And her forthcoming publications track the development of a documentary apparatus, psychometric tests, protocols, case report forms that could transform New Age therapeutic techniques and body practices and subjective states into standardized, objective, bureaucratic evidence of MDMA's efficacy and safety. So thanks very much for being with us today. Catherine, the floor is yours for your presentation.
Great. Well, thank you to both Kevin and Agnieszka for welcoming me here. I'm going to share my screen. I have a slideshow presentation. Let's see. There. So my talk today is going to be a shortened version of an article that I published in Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry this year, entitled "What Can the Chemical Hold? The Politics of Efficacy in Psychedelic Research." But I'm going to focus really on kind of a pared down version of that, where I'm going to talk a little bit about my research project on an ethnography of MDMA-assisted therapy, ethnography of the development of MDMA as a prescription pharmaceutical. And I'm going to lay out an argument that I make in that article about two different efficacies that are talked about both in clinical research with psychedelics, but also in the underground therapeutic use of them. The efficacy that emerges from the drugs themselves and the efficacy that emerges from the self that is experiencing the drug. And I'm going to try to argue that it's helpful to think of these two different kind of efficacies as both simultaneously operating as discourses around psychedelics currently, but ones which have really fundamentally different politics associated with them. And while I make the argument that these two different efficacies can be mutually included with one another, and I draw here on the work of Anne-Marie Moll, the politics that are at the core of the therapeutic development of these use in their and their use in the underground are not necessarily ones which can exist easily together. So for those of you who are not super familiar, I have just a very quick history of therapeutic research with psychedelics. So hold on one second. So from the 1950s to 1960s, there were several methods of integrating psychedelic substances such as LSD, mescaline, psilocybin into psychiatric practices. In North America, you primarily had psychedelic therapy, which utilized large doses of psychedelics to bring about what were termed mystical states of consciousness, in which people might be able to then have these transformative states. Whereas in Europe and England, you primarily used lower doses as part of a technique called psycholytic therapy, which was supposed to induce a more dreamlike state of consciousness from which material from the unconscious could then surface. I draw here a little bit on the work of historian Matthew Orman, who's written quite a bit about the shifts that happened around the regulation of clinical research with psychedelics in the 1960s and how that led to changes in the status of psychedelic therapy. So in 1962, as a result of the thalidomide scare, in which there were a number of babies born with defects after their mothers had taken the drug thalidomide, the US Congress passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment, which essentially brought about a new era in the regulation of clinical research itself. So I think we have all in the COVID era become a lot more familiar with the different stages of pharmaceutical research and development. But prior to 1962, it was not quite as tightly regulated. What Orman argues is that, contra the argument that the counterculture brought about a backlash against psychedelics, it was really these shifts in the regulation of research itself that led to psychedelics slowly, research around psychedelics slowly petering out. In part because psychedelics didn't fit within the new, or not the new, but the bureaucratized structure of the double-blind randomized controlled trial. And this is for many reasons, one of which is that psychedelics are not easily blinded in research. But as he argues, research with these drugs went on up into and was funded up into the 1970s. In 1970, the US Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, in which many psychedelics were placed into Schedule I. The parameters of Schedule I within the United States mean that a drug has a high potential for abuse and no recognized therapeutic application. What this meant is that essentially it is very difficult, but not impossible, to do research with drugs in Schedule I. In the 1970s, MDMA sort of stepped into a place that had been closed down by the Controlled Substances Act. MDMA is not considered a traditional psychedelic, but it was integrated. It has its own kind of unique set of properties, and particularly in California, was integrated into the existing practices of psychedelic therapy that were going underground at that time. This lasted until 1985, when the DEA scheduled MDMA, placed it in Schedule I, which then led to the founding of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which has been a sponsor of clinical trials with MDMA. In 2004, they were finally able to launch their first phase 2 study, looking at using MDMA to assist therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. The landscape of research with psychedelics is, of course, broader than that, but my research focuses on psychedelics, on MDMA, because I conducted my field work, as I'll talk about shortly, with MAPS. So my background, as Kevin already mentioned, is as a medical anthropologist. And medical anthropologists are interested in a variety of different kinds of healing systems, thinking about the way that different cultures and societies have thought about the body, its relationship to the mind, what counts as healing, what counts as efficacy. My research is also informed by science and technology studies, which examines how knowledge gets made. In 2010, I started conducting an ethnographic research project with MAPS as a part of their clinical trial research team, which means that I wanted to immerse myself in the practices in clinical research. I wanted to think about all the day-to-day practices that researchers have to use in order to develop regulated, standardized knowledge about MDMA's efficacy and safety in order to change its scheduling classification. During that time, I also attended conferences, fundraisers, other MAPS events. And actually, as I'll talk quite a bit about today, I did a small number of interviews, qualitative interviews with therapists who exist in the underground, who practice psychedelic therapy, using psychedelics as an adjunct to therapy, essentially illicitly, right, without government approval. When I started my doctoral fieldwork, I had a lot of questions, but two questions that I want to bring up today is that first, I was interested in trying to better understand how researchers navigate both the bureaucratic and scientific issues in producing evidence around MDMA safety and efficacy. So I was interested in how they navigated the questions around placebos and blinds, how they took knowledge about an experiential therapy that used a psychedelic and translated that into standardized and quantified knowledge that could be submitted to the FDA. And I was also interested in what kinds of political claims animated these trials. Many of the researchers in the psychedelic space argue, and I think that they're trying to put science ahead of politics, right? That their research is scientifically grounded, objective, and I am in no way trying to dispute that claim. However, coming from science and technology studies, I was also interested in thinking about how doing research, the very act of doing science, can be a political act. And in thinking about what the different political vision, right, the different, the vision of the future, of who might get to use these drugs, of what kind of access might be envisioned. So the problem that I'm going to talk about today, the kind of main question I want to discuss, is that I kept coming up as I was doing field work between these two different understandings of efficacy, or two different articulations of efficacy. On the one hand, there was the discourse that circulated at academic conferences, in the kind of publications around psychedelics, that it is the chemicals essentially that do the work. It is chemicals that produce these therapeutic effects. On the other hand, there's also this articulation that also, it's not actually the drug. The drug is there, but it's the self that does the work. That the true source of healing within psychedelic therapy is something that is catalyzed, an experience that's catalyzed from the chemicals, but doesn't necessitate its presence. And there is, I argue, a fundamental tension between these two efficacies, in that in order to legalize, or medicalize is probably a better term, MDMA-assisted therapy, you have to make a claim about what a drug does for a particular diagnostic population. The current clinical trials are looking at treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. There's planned trials on looking at social anxiety in autistic adults. Those are very circumscribed groups of people that get access. And that kind of therapy, right, the argument that that drug works for those people is actually at odds in many ways with the kind of vision of what psychedelics can do when you think about the self being at the center of efficacy. So what I'll talk about today is I set up in my article two different understandings of efficacy. And I pull on Max Weber's concept of ideal types. And ideal types are really thinking tools. They don't necessarily exist neatly in the world, but they are ways of setting up oppositions between concepts that can let you think more clearly about what's happening. So in this article, I set up two different ideal types of efficacy, right? I have chemical efficacy on the one hand, which argues that psychedelic efficacy emanates from the chemical structures themselves. It primarily draws upon a neuro and biomedical understanding of the body. So it is what a chemical does within neurotransmitters and to different brain structures. Its knowledge is standardized and quantified. So You have to have both a standardized way of diagnosing post-traumatic stress disorder that exists across all individuals, and you have to have a way of comparing that in a way that can be statistically verified. And fundamentally, that chemical efficacy is always tied to treatment populations. It's never, is MDMA efficacious? It has to be efficacious for a group of people. In contrast, self-efficacy, and this emanates from this self, right? It's something that can utilize a chemical, but many other practices which initiate non-ordinary states of consciousness can also produce self-efficacy. It fundamentally relies upon a deepening knowledge of this that the self gains during an experience, and its potential is universal. It's not constrained by a treatment population. In this next section, I'll talk a little bit more. I'm going to pull up some quotes from the interviews that I did with underground therapists. And I'll go through three main quotations, one highlighting the chemical as a key to unlocking a therapeutic potential, the other, the chemical as simply a road or a vehicle, or sorry, as a road to this efficacious state. And third, we'll look at a couple quotations that look at the importance of self-knowledge to psychedelic efficacy. So this first quotation here is from an interview I did with David, who is an underground psychedelic therapist. David had never had any formal training. He had primarily experimented with psychedelics himself, and then kind of fell into the practice of helping to guide people. And he said in my interview, the main thing and the most important thing about psychedelic drugs or plants is that they don't give you the experience. The experience comes from inside yourself. The psychedelic is simply a catalyst. It is a key to the door. Now, of course, Aldous Huxley famously used this metaphor around keys and doors in psychedelics. So it's one that I think has circulated quite widely. But one of the things that I want to draw out from this is that the psychedelic is a part of this picture of healing and of self-growth, but it doesn't do the work, right? It simply puts the individual in a state in which that work can happen. This same idea came up in an interview that I did with another underground therapist, Alan. Alan had also trained as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. For those who aren't familiar, Stan Groff, who worked in psychedelic therapy, developed holotropic breathwork as an alternative way to reach non-ordinary states of consciousness without the use of chemicals. And he did this in the response to LSD becoming a scheduled substance that couldn't be used legally. So this is Alan quoting Stan Groff. He says, Stan Groff has a boilerplate lecture that he gives. I've heard it dozens of times, and it's called The Healing Potential of Non-Ordinary States of Consciousness. It is not the healing potential of psychedelic drugs. It is not the healing potential of holotropic breathwork. It is the healing potential of non-ordinary states. Because he understands that the non-ordinary state is the goal. And often when people are gormanizing about psychedelics, I'm saying to myself, this is like going to Cancun and all you can discuss is how you got to Cancun. You know nothing about how marvelous it was, so beautiful. We swam in the ocean. It's all like I took the highway and then at the stoplight, I took a right and then I got on the expressway. It's like describing the process of getting there rather than the experience of being there. The philosopher Heidegger, he says, our whole angst of our post-industrial lives that we've forgotten how to be, just to be content with ourselves, to be able to sit, to be able to know who we are within certain limits, certain restrictions, deficits, whatever. But we just know who we are. And that is what this work can bring us to. So I pair these two quotations because I think there is this parallel use of metaphor between what David describes as using psychedelics as simply keys that open doors, and Alan describes as roads that get you to a place like Cancun. They are both these metaphors of transportation, right, and of movement, but in them, the psychedelic is not the goal, right? It's simply part of the infrastructure through which one travels. And importantly here at the end, for Alan, the goal is really to this deeper understanding of the self. Clara was another therapist that I interviewed, and I asked her in the therapist, so what do you do, right? What do you call yourself, right? Because I was asking whether or not she used a term therapist or underground or a guide. And Clara said, what do I do? Toward the end of my last mushroom journey, some of my clients came up, and I was thinking about my work with them. And I thought, you cannot call yourself a psychologist because that's a Western term for a Western psychotherapy. You don't do that kind of thing. So I said, what do I do? A voice inside of me said, you help people to find out who they are and what life is about and how to lead their life fully. So I get what I'm doing. So I like this quote both because there is this doubleness to it, right? Clara has this understanding about herself while she herself is on a mushroom journey. But that also that she sees her work not necessarily as being about this broader quest to self-understanding. In my interview with Alan, he called this, he used the language of gnosis. In contrast, on the other end, right, we can think, I want to talk a little bit about chemical efficacy. And I'll go back to the guides in a minute. If self-efficacy is built around the idea that chemicals are kind of catalysts, but the real goal is this non-ordinary state, and that the true source of efficacy in the non-ordinary state is the self itself, and that self-knowledge is the goal. In contrast, in chemical efficacy, it is an understanding that looks at the self through a neurobiomedical lens. Depends upon neurological understandings of effects. And it also works with diagnostic specificity. So as I've said before, it works through linking chemicals to specific diagnostic populations. So this quote is from an article published by Michael Mithofer and several other psychedelic researchers in Lancet Psychiatry. And it's a rather long quote, but I'll try to read it as clearly as I can. But he's talking about what it is that MDMA does, right? Like, why is it therapeutic? This effect can be conceptualized in various ways. That the pro-social effects of MDMA might improve the therapeutic alliance with patients who have difficulty trusting. That MDMA in a therapeutic setting provides several hours in the optimal arousal zone during which therapeutic change is possible. That MDMA enables memory retrieval and reconsolidation with new associations to safety, or that MDMA causes a shift from constrained styles of thinking to less rigid, unrestrained thinking. Each of these concepts is consistent with what is known about the physiological effects of MDMA, which include relapse and reuptake inhibition of serotonin and to a lesser extent dopamine and norepinephrine, release of oxytocin and prolactin, decreased activity in the amygdala and hippocampus, and perhaps increased activity in medial prefrontal cortex, increase in resting state functional connectivity between amygdala and hippocampus, and decreased RSFC between ventromedial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex. Now, what I think is particularly striking about this quote is that it layers together both the psychodynamic understandings of what might be happening with MDMA, but it links them to what is happening in the brain, to an understanding of the effects of the drug that really focus on what the drug does to neurotransmitters, to brain structures. I'll go back. Within the clinical trial, of course, in order to show that MDMA is effective, right, one has to have a psychometric test, right? Has to show it does something to the diagnosis. One of the reasons that MAPS worked with PTSD is because, both because there was evidence that MDMA could be quite efficacious for people with treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, but also because PTSD has a diagnostic gold standard, which is the CAPS, the clinician-administered PTSD scale. And I think in part, what we have to remember is significant about the way that chemical efficacy work is that it requires that you have these kinds of techniques that can stabilize and standardize effects in relationship to these diagnostic criteria. So Dr. Mithoefer and his wife might find that in their sessions with patients, you do have these increased therapeutic alliances or pro-social effects, right? But ultimately, right, those on their own don't measure efficacy. It has to be this change to the CAP score that essentially links that chemical to a certain population of people. So Anne-Marie Moll in the Body Multiple makes an argument for what she calls mutual inclusion. And I find this concept really helpful for thinking about what the relationship between chemical and self-efficacy might be. Because what Moll argues is that different perspectives and practices of specialists can enact a disease and a body in different ways. And she's thinking about in the context of a hospital in which you have the coordination of information from a radiologist and a neurologist and a nurse and a patient and a primary care clinician, all of which who see the disease and the body in very different ways. And what she argues is that all these different versions of the disease, right, and the body can be coordinated even though they exist in tension and at times conflict with each other, right? Which is what, to some extent, I'm arguing is happening between chemical and self-efficacy. And she argues that these enacted objects do not exist in Euclidean space, in which little parts can be assembled to make a greater whole. She argues that they are related through intransitivity, in which things that are different can exist both alongside and inside of one another. And she uses an analogy from the work of philosopher Michael Serres, who talks about plastic bags in contrast to nested boxes. So in a Euclidean space of transitive relations, you know, the small box is put inside the larger box, but the larger box can't go vice versa. Right? And instead, he talks in intransitive relations, we can think about plastic bags. So a yellow bag can be folded down and put within a blue bag. And then the opposite can happen. The yellow bag can be opened up and the blue bag can be folded down and put within it. And I find this a really helpful way to think about how we can relate chemical and self-efficacy. Because it's not that chemical efficacy is simply including within it self-efficacy, or self-efficacy is including chemical efficacy, right? But it's that at different moments, they can be coordinated by different actors to make different arguments. So this quote is also from a piece that Michael Mithoefer wrote. And in it, he talks about the inner healer. And this is really explicitly a discourse that really draws upon the understanding of self-efficacy. It comes out of the work of Stan Grof in holotropic breath work. And the inner healer, or the inner healing intelligence of the subject, is the innate capacity or wisdom of the self to guide its own healing process. And he writes that this is writing about the kind of technique they're developing within the MDMA-assisted therapy trials. This is in keeping with the principle that the optimal tactic is for the therapist and the participants to approach each session with a largely non-directive stance or beginner's mind to allow the individual's own healing intelligence to determine which course the session will take. And I think in this concept, you can see here that even as there is this very nuanced argument about what MDMA does to neurotransmitters, there's also this articulation that in order for psychedelic therapy, in order for MDMA-assisted therapy to work, right, the drug can't operate on its own. It requires the therapist to facilitate a state in which this inner healer, this innate capacity of the self, will guide the healing process. In this next example, right, we can see how the underground therapists can also articulate their own way in which they can incorporate a neurobiological understanding of the work of the chemical into their own understanding of this work of the self. So Clara, when I interviewed Clara, she said, she and I were going back and forth kind of talking about how it is that psychedelics can heal and how this relates to the neurobiology of depression. She said, we don't know. We really don't know. Clearly, it is an imbalance. It's the chicken and the egg. We don't know if PTSD creates depression. We know that repressed anger causes depression and in turn creates a depression, meaning a flatness of feeling. When someone cannot feel because it is too overwhelming, we know that. We have all had that to some extent. The idea that we are saturated with emotion, so we stop feeling. We've all had it. I have, certainly. So when we sustain that long enough, our chemistry changes. And then can we say we have a depletion of serotonin? Well, sure. But why did you start to flatten or start with? What comes first? Is it the emotion that creates the serotonin depletion, or is it the serotonin depletion that creates the emotion? I don't know. From my point as a psychotherapist, I'm interested in exploring the psyche and the emotions that are held in it. I believe in liberation and freedom and vitality. So my job is to see if there's any way to renew vitality in the system. I come from the place of, can I support and contribute to the revitalization of this organism as a person? That's where I come from. So in this quotation, you can see how she's not rejecting a neurobiological understanding of what depression is, or even in how psychedelics might intervene in it, right? She can work between the two, because it's possible that simply having this repressed emotion produces a change in serotonin, and that once one is able to change the relationship to those repressed emotions, that one can then rebalance one's neurobiological circuitry. So I think Anne-Marie Moll's argument about mutual inclusion is really helpful for thinking about both epistemic and ontological questions. We can think about how chemical and self-efficacy have to be coordinated at different moments in the underground, in the ways in which researchers write about the effects of these drugs. But there is always, I think, this remaining political tension that exists about who will be included if the medicalization of psychedelics goes forward. As I've said, chemical efficacy includes those in diagnostic populations. Self-efficacy is conceptualized as a universal human potential. It might intervene in a diagnosis, but it doesn't require a diagnosis in order to be efficacious. Because if we go back to the quotation from Alan, it's really fundamentally derived from this modernist angst about being alienated from our sense of being. So if we think about what medicalization might look like, right? If in the United States, if the FDA approves MDMA assisted therapy for use and changes its scheduling classification, the ideas of chemical and self-efficacy will not have equal purchase. It's quite likely that there will be intense supervision of scripts by both insurance companies, the FDA, the DEA, that those that are licensed to be able to work with MDMA will have to go through professional licensures. The president of MAPS, Rick Doblin, has envisioned a distribution system in the past similar to what happens with methadone, which is intensely curtailed. So on the one hand, right, within self-efficacy, the possibilities of who might benefit for psychedelics are much bigger than the diagnostic limitations. It's not clear that within medicalization that same possibility will exist for people. It's in fact, what is most likely is that it will be limited to people whose diagnostic criteria are met. Okay. So I think I will stop there for questions and comments. As I've talked for, I think, a good solid half hour.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Hendy. Thank you very much.
Yes.
You can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So yeah, if anyone in the audience has any comments or questions, make sure to pop them into the Q&A tab there. First question maybe I would ask is, you're a trained ethnographer, and you're working with some concepts from science and technology studies, and social studies of science. Can you say a little bit about how you approach your research? When do you draw theory in, and how do you see yourself working with it?
I think that's a great question. So for me, theory is something that we use to think about the world, but also the things we learn about the world should inform our theoretical concepts, right? So that's one of the reasons why I like Max Weber's ideal types, is because I'm not trying to argue that we have these two rigid boxes, chemical and self-efficacy, but in setting up kind of a dichotomy between them, I think it lets you more productively see what is happening, the ways in which they align at times and don't at others. So for me, theoretical concepts are ones that give us a richer understanding of what is happening, but optimally it should be in a reciprocal relationship in which you have to rethink your theory in relationship to what you're encountering when you're doing research.
Yeah, I think it's just instructive for other people formulating some research designs in this area, and who are interested in ethnography in lots of different areas, but aren't sure how to use theory, how to get going with theory in that kind of research design.
And, if we think about it from the perspective of research design, good research really starts with a conversation, right? There's something that other people who are looking at this phenomena don't quite understand or haven't been able to think about, right? A contradiction that exists, right? And whatever you go out and do, whether it's a survey or a laboratory study or an ethnography, there should be some connection between what is unanswered and what you're going to learn when you do that research, right? So my current postdoc is funded by the NIH, and I spend quite a bit of time in interdisciplinary research contexts. And one of the nice things about that is that as I reflect back on ethnography, I think the same principles of what makes good research design for ethnography also hold for what happens for experimental designs and in laboratories as well, right? You have to be able to articulate what we don't know and connect it to what you're going to do, right? So I did research. I know a lot about clinical research with psychedelic substances, right? I don't necessarily know a lot about the indigenous practices around psychedelics, right? So I would never try to speak to those things, but I do have my, I did, in watching the kind of minute practices of how clinical researchers go about stabilizing the effects of a drug, have a lot to say to those questions.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in with one other question. I've always been really interested in this literature on object studies. So there's the paper by Anna Marie Moll on the bush pump as a fluid object. And then there's that paper by John Law and Vicky Singleton on fire objects. And I think it's liver disease. And it's like sometimes liver disease, it's there like a fire, but sometimes it's out. The different ontological and maybe epistemological characteristics of these objects. So thinking about chemical efficacy, what kind of object would MDMA be for you? What kind of object do you think MDMA is?
I mean, I think that it is different things at different moments. At the end of the article, I talk a little bit about the work of Andrew Barry, who has he develops the concept of informed materials, which he gets a little bit out of this history of chemistry. It's kind of this one-off line from a history of chemistry written by Isabella Stengers and Bernadette Bresson-Vincenz. And he uses it to think about the ways that chemical structures are enriched in information in the process of research. Right. So he talks about this historic line of association. He's pulling on the work of the philosopher of science Ian Whitehead, but that chemicals are not static objects, right? That they have this potential to be continually invented and reinvented in new informational contexts. And that, that argument's been really powerful for me to think about what is happening with research around psychedelics, because it opens up the idea that they are becoming something new, precisely not because the structure themselves are changing, because they're existing in new informational environments, right? So while psychedelics were used in research contexts in the 50s and 60s, and certainly used extensively in therapeutic contexts, they've never been quite put in the same position as they are in the contemporary research world, right? And I would argue that part of the distinction is through these use of psychometric tests, which standardize efficacies in relationship to diagnostic populations. If you look at like the 50s and 60s research, it was all over the map because you really just had a lot of psychiatric institutions and people handing psychedelics to kind of mixed cohorts, right? So you might have someone diagnosed with alcohol use disorder and someone with schizophrenia, and they just were trying it out, right? So, I think it's important to think, as we think about what kind of objects they are now, one of my arguments is that these diagnostic populations are really fundamental to how their efficacy is being constituted. And that then one of, I think, the limitations of continuing to think through the body multiple, as wonderful as it is that, and also through, I think, to some extent, the informed materials language, is that there is a limit to those things, right? There's not going to be multiple political possibilities around these drugs, at least if we're thinking about politics in terms of who will have the kind of access to them in a legal context.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Agnieszka, did you want to ask some questions at this point?
Sure, I have a few questions actually. I was just making tons of notes. So when you, just like maybe drawing on what you said just recently about efficacy and specific population and informational environment. So I completely agree. And I think also I would add like information environment, but also like legal environment, because I see how they are producing different pathways in Canada.
You said the economic environment too?
Legal environment.
Oh, legal, yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
How they are producing different pathways. Because I'm like just focusing on it, so it just kind of came to my mind. But when you talk about efficacy, what I'm observing right now, there is a discussion about intersectional kind of approach to efficacy. So and it seems that there are some popping up some divisions among psychedelic researchers in terms of access of population based on race, but also efficacy based on this kind of factors. So I wonder if there was like any discussion during your research, or a struggle how MAPS researchers and scientists were like dealing with it.
I think that's a really great question. So I think you're referring to these questions around culturally sensitive work, including broader population, like making sure it's the critiques that it's become a kind of white only space, right? And that this could then, I know MAPS is trying to do training programs to diversify the therapists and part of that argument being that if you're going to reach different trauma, like populations whose trauma is tied to their socially and culturally and racially marginalized status, you need therapists who can be able to really work with that. I think those conversations were really nascent when I was doing research. I think they've been I think this is one of the effects of a lot of the political conversations then that have come up since, the last 4 or 5 years, really starting to reshape the conversations that are happening around psychedelics. And so I don't have really well formulated thoughts around it. I go back to, again, I think what I think is interesting there, right? If you go back prior to the MDMA assisted trials, there have been attempts to create legal spaces for work with psychedelics, right? In the US, largely centering around trying to claim religious exemption, which over and over have been foreclosed and curtailed, precisely because the fear is that you can't just simply, you can use peyote within the context of the Native American church, but if you are not, quote unquote, biologically Native American, you cannot then access that, right? I haven't kept up as much on the ayahuasca rulings, which get more complicated, but, there's been this really fraught tension between, so Beth Pavanelli, the anthropologist, writes about a little bit about the ayahuasca struggles in, Empire of Love. She has a collection of essays where she's talking about political claims based on kind of genealogical status versus this ontological status of the liberal self, right? So, the claim that I can just take a drug because I have a right to cognitive liberty, and I should be able, as long as I'm not harming anyone, various states of consciousness should all be accessible to me. Right. And maybe, right. And she's using the case around psychedelics as a way in which the courts have prescribed that, to say, no, if you're going to do that practice, it has to exist within a traditional ritual that you can make what she calls a genealogical claim, right? You can't make this claim that you should get to experiment with this drug just because you like it, and it brings you spiritual self-awareness. You have to be able to show that you are a member of a group with this long-standing tie to this practice in order to get access to it. And I think there's this larger, and like within the psychedelic supportive community, there is this, it's not nascent. I think it's an argument that's out there that we all have a certain right to cognitive liberty, and we should just get to try these drugs, right? That experimenting is a fundamental legal right. And part of what I'm interested in my work is the way that then becomes deeply, that vision is actually not opened up by medicalization, right? Medicalization opens up a very narrow route. But then you have this interesting way where I think there's now this attempt to say, okay, we should diversify within here, right? This can't be a white only space. And Steve Epstein, who's a historian of science, wrote a book called Inclusion, and he talks there about the inclusion and difference paradigm, which gets kind of instituted within the National Institutes of Health in the right around the turn of the millennium, right? And this is the argument that, traditionally we have excluded women and minorities from a lot of research, and we need to diversify. So now if you do research within the NIH, you have to show that you are recruiting a diverse sample of people. And so I think this kind of pulling in of this inclusion argument with psychedelics is actually, I don't know quite where to go with it. It certainly is a different sort of claim than the one that says we just all deserve cognitive liberty and we just need to smash the system, right? But it's also one that says that difference matters and that the psychedelic community psychedelic research should support that difference. And I don't really have much more to say on it but I think it is quite interesting what is happening in that space.
Yeah, I think it is. I've been reading like Monica Williams, and she's been bringing up the issues of diagnosis, right? So some diagnoses that are tested are not necessarily, prominent in specific ethnic groups, but also I think more and more it's coming up about like violence during psychedelic trials in the past, and how it kind of precludes some people from participating in trials. but also it seems that it's coming like, from underground, people participating in underground environment, and not necessarily as therapists, but they're starting to speak about, violence and abuse. And I think like, I think it's becoming like diversified, and I think it's becoming kind of like more, because it seems that it's very sterilized, at least was the conversation, very kind of procured, but now it's, I think it's becoming more kind of, messy. And I think it's interesting in terms of, like how is it going to be dealt by investors, etc. And
Right. Yes. There's this question about making profits around these drugs.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Kevin, do you want to go next? Because I have a few more questions, but if anybody also in the audience would like to ask.
Yeah, you can go ahead. Go ahead with another question.
So I was also thinking about diagnostics when you were talking about how it is diagnostic based, which I agree, but it's more maybe a comment. What's going on in Canada right now, some researchers associated with MAPS are trying to include couple therapies.
Mm-hmm.
I think in this way, it a bit kind of breaks the diagnostics centered therapies, right? Because the one couple is only has to be diagnosed with PTSD, and the second one is just a person who is in a relation with this. So I was just thinking about it when you were talking. But I'm actually interested in. I read your other article when you talk about the safety, and it was really interesting. I don't know, like if you would, how you argued that differentiation between MDMA and ecstasy was used kind of strategically and produced strategically. I wonder if you want to just outline your argument.
Sure. Right. And that are, like these two articles are, safety and efficacy are the twin pillars of pharmaceutical drug development, right? So in some ways, the two articles were me thinking through each of those two sides. And in the article about safety, I was really struck when I started my field work. I was talking with one of the researchers and I said, well, I'm really interested in what you're doing with ecstasy. And, they cut me off and said, no, we are not studying ecstasy. We are studying MDMA. Ecstasy is this totally other thing. And what we do is MDMA. And if you look at actually what the argument is, and you have to really, I won't go through all of the kind of debates about whether or not ecstasy or MDMA was neurotoxic, that came up in, the 1990s and early aughts. But I think that comment that the two things are different always was something that I thought was really fascinating, because where does the difference between the two structures lie, right? Now, the researchers claim that it's because of purity, which, is a good claim, right? And it's one which, that's why we have pharmaceutical regulation, is to preserve kind of the safety, like the purity of these substances. But also in that argument, in that article, what I argue is that actually really what is critical within the clinical trial is that difference in the structure between supposedly ecstasy being messy and MDMA being pure is actually really a difference about safety, right? And that what the researchers were really trying to show is that MDMA could be administered safely. Okay? And to some extent, if they hadn't been able to find that, if they hadn't been able to demonstrate that, as they have been able to thus far with their research, that the distinction between MDMA and ecstasy wouldn't really hold, right? I mean, you'd still have one that is pure, but actually what's really critical is showing that MDMA is safe, right? And that's what allows it to then become distinct from ecstasy, right? I forget where I'm going with that. But I mean, I think, the question of, I think efficacy always gets a lot more kind of media play because it's a much more fascinating conversation. But really, I think the questions of safety are much more pertinent to medicalization, because if the drugs hadn't been able, to administer them safely and to be able to show that there weren't adverse events, they wouldn't be able to build public trust around the drug, right? In that article, I don't talk about public trust, but I think as we go through all the vaccine wars and their own discussions of safety of, COVID vaccines and things like that, I think that is part of what the work of those trials was about, was trying to show that these drugs are safe, to show that they're safe to regulators, to show that they're safe to people in psychiatry, and the public at large.
Yeah, and I think it links what you were talking about, like access, right? How safety is right now used to kind of preclude access in a way, because it's argued that it's safe, but it has to be in specific environment under specific conditions. And so efficacy could be like, enhancing like desire to take, but then it's like the safety is like really the platform for building this kind of, like infrastructure and money and investors and like, yeah. So I think it's very important, maybe not as kind of like highlighted, but for the, for the glue between researcher investors, I think this is this is so important.
And I've heard a lot of conversations, some concern that what's happening, that there's sort of two vectors of concern. One is that all of this kind of investor money is going to lead to a set of unsafe practices, that they are not going to think in the same careful way about trying to create safe practices for administering these drugs, right? That it's sort of like, hey, this is great, just go take them. And, and also, I mean, I think there's been the conversations around potential ethical violations by therapists, I think have come really onto the table in the past few years, which also do speak. And I think there's been concerns raised by people that unless really clear guidelines for safe use, and meaning kind of ethical, like a broad sense, not just that you might have brain damage. Right? The clinical trials were really concerned with like, do people have, adverse events? But we're really talking about a safe space in which therapists are adhering to ethical principles. I think now there's a concern that those kind of dimensions of safety haven't really been well articulated. Was it in MAPS Canada that they had? Anyways, this is being recorded, so I won't speculate. But I know that there are a lot of questions about what, as you take something that's been in the underground and move it to the into a more potentially beneficially more scrutinized space, that a lot of the questions that haven't been really thought through need to be.
Yeah, I think that there is a critical writing emerging on this issue, and I was thinking because I also work in pharmaceutical regulation and modernization of clinical trials, and decentralization of clinical trials and virtual trials and teletrials, and all this kind of issues that under the circumstances of psychedelic substances may be really, it can be potentially dangerous, and they should be really, it has advantages, but also we have to think about risks. I have maybe last question because I can go on and on, but there was recently I just also read an article about researchers. So this is related to the design and being a researcher. So this article was arguing that researchers should be free to disclose their, this kind of experiences with psychedelics, right? And often they are not given space for that. In my research, I felt that I was kind of assumed that I'm advocate, for psychedelics. So I was wondering, what was your experience as a researcher working with MAPS, which was very dedicated to pushing specific agenda, right?
I mean, I've always noted in my kind of broad, so I've been doing research around either MDMA or ecstasy in different contexts since, around 2000. But I mean, I think it's slightly uncommon for there to be people who are really invested in researching who don't have personal experiences, though I think that is changing. And it was interesting, when you do encounter researchers, because it is now if you look at how big MAPS's clinical trial team now is, right, they've just been hiring and expanding. And so, I think that you do see a more diverse set of experiences of people coming in. But I think that's interesting. And I had this piece that I might put in, I'm sort of working on a book in between writing grants, but there was a scene at one of the conferences where one of the panelists just asked everyone in the room to raise their hand if they had tried LSD, right? And, you can imagine another, like at a psychiatric conference, would they ask all the therapists to raise their hands and say, have you tried Prozac, right? Have you tried Adderall, right? The idea, like there is something really fundamental about being experienced with these drugs that does animate a lot of the research and the engagement with them. MAPS had a healthy volunteer studies that they used to be able to therapy unless they themselves are familiar with these states. And so they were able to get a healthy volunteer study approved, which allowed them to then kind of use that as a vehicle for training therapists. But that is a real fundamental difference. And that's a good example of the kind of hurdle that they've had to kind of negotiate in developing these clinical trials, where you don't need to make sure that all your doctors have tried, I'll pull out another one. Wellbutrin, right? You can rely on the fact that, that's not their job, but being experienced and having that kind of firsthand knowledge is considered important within psychedelic therapy.
Yeah, for me, it was not maybe specifically asked whether I tried or not, but whether I'm like working as volunteers toward legalization.
Oh, okay.
So it was like, so who are you working with? Where are you volunteering? And I think it was, I don't know, a kind of moment on discomfort, assuming that you only come to the research because you want to advocate it. And I think it kind of shaped some relation, because I'm new to this research, I haven't been done for a long time, but I'm coming from kind of trying to come from like critical perspective. I don't know. It's not that I don't know. I think it kind of influenced whether some researcher would follow up with me or not. Because I haven't clearly declared that I'm working towards legalization.
Oh.
Medicalization and legalization.
Right.
That's what's kind of interesting. Yeah, I think I don't have any more questions. I have, but you're already getting tired.
Maybe just one last question about your current work and what kind of directions you're going with in your current work, and any kind of lines of flight away from previous research designs.
Yeah, so I'm actually, I'm in a postdoctoral fellowship where I'm doing bioethics and genomics. But it does tie back because I'm actually looking at issues around the use of genetic testing to guide prescription medication for psychotropic pharmaceuticals. So pharmacogenomics to guide people's decision-making around depression medications. And it is a very different world than psychedelic therapy. And, but it is interesting because for me, one of the connections, I'm currently developing interviews that I'll do with patients, which will talk about how who have undergone this kind of genetic testing. I think thinking about how this fits within their larger kind of struggles around depression. So it is definitely, if the psychedelic drugs were looking at a different model for trying to think about how we can have chemically induced or pharmaceutically induced healing for psychiatric diagnoses, I'm now in this very much more the what they are kind of drawing or trying to weave themselves into in this tricky way, which is the world of psychopharmaceuticals, where, you know, what does Prozac do? Well, you take it this many weeks, and then we look at your, like, you know, reporting on your depression metrics, and then, you know, we evaluate side effects, and we then adjust dosages. It's a very different model that they're trying to sort of tweak with genomics. So I haven't figured out everything. I think there's a lot of, like, I'm still interested in the questions of like how chemical objects get constituted with this genomic information, but I'm still working on connecting the dots.
As always, we need new research.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being here today and telling us about your work and your research. And before we go, I'll just say the next talk in the series, Dr. Christian Elcock, Psychedelic New York, A Short History of LSD in a Global Metropolis. That's December 9th at 1 p.m. Central. But yeah, thanks again, Dr. Hendy, for being here. Thanks, Dr. Dole, for co-hosting. Thanks, Evan, for making everything happen behind the scenes. And thanks to the audience as well.
Thank
All
you
right.
very much.
Thank you, guys. It was nice meeting everybody.
It was nice meeting you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Stay safe. Take care.